if if you're going to talk about the beginning of the NHL, you kind of have to talk about Eddie Livingstone. Uh, this is a guy who was really reviled by the National Hockey Association's other owners. He's born September 12th, 1884. He died September 11th, 1945. 1 day short of his 61st birthday, probably because the NHL said he's not allowed to be 61. He was an OHL referee and reporter, and the interesting part of this is he would report on games that he refereed. It's an interesting idea. I don't know that referees now could get away with it, but would that be an interesting thing if you could read a report by Kelly Sutherland after a game on a game he just refereed? How excellent it was, or how poor it was, or it would be an interesting thing to see. He owned the Toronto Shamrocks slash Blue Shirts. Yeah. He was from money. He's the youngest of three kids, and he was really excited about hockey. He played hockey in university. He coached hockey at various levels. He was a manager. He genuinely became a hockey owner because he loved the game of hockey. So this wasn't, I'm a billionaire. Here's my money. No, he wasn't that rich, that well off. He was a businessman who just didn't like other people very much. Um, he bought the Toronto Ontarios of the NHA in 1913. Let me repeat, the name of the team was the Toronto Ontarios. That's creative. And during the 14-15 season, they changed from orange jerseys to green and were renamed the Shamrocks. So the Toronto Ontarios wore orange jerseys. I imagine they were just stellar. Um, he renames them the Shamrocks, but right away he's making other owners angry. Um, February of 1915, there's a game between his team and the Montreal Wanderers. The Wanderers are this great god team at the time, and the Toronto Blue Shirt Ontario Shamrocks. They hadn't come up with a good name yet. They didn't play the game, and so the owner Sam Lichtenhein, who did not get along with Eddie Livingstone because nobody did. Uh, they forfeit the game, and then Lichtenhein's like, all right, well, we'll make it up later, and then he said no, I'm not gonna make it up later. Screw you, Livingstone. Livingstone tries to sue, and I think the Wanderers gave him $300. I believe it was $300 he got for it. That was the cost saved by the team for not having to travel to Toronto to play the game they would have played. Um, Interesting. Sam Lichtenhein would make a $3,000 offer to Toronto to get rid of their owner. Eddie Livingstone deciding, screw you, then offered the Montreal Wanderers $5,000 to get rid of Sam Lichtenhein. Some squabbling going on here. Now, when he bought the Blue Shirts, he still owned the Shamrocks. So he owned two Toronto teams at the same time, and the NHL or the NHA said you can't do that. And he's like, "Yep." Then there was a deadline. He ignored it. He was given a deadline to sell one of the teams. He ignored it, and he threatened to move the team to Boston in 1916. I got that spelled wrong. Anyways, I'm just gonna take the threatened and two out because I spelled threaten wrong. So he was going to move the team to Boston in 1916. I'll just put a question mark there. Um, and this was an interesting dilemma, wasn't it? He owned two teams. Then when he only owned one team. The 228th Battalion was brought in. 228th Battalion, who were they? They were Canadian infantry members who played in khakis. He didn't like it. But why were they brought in? They were brought in because there was an odd number of teams. The National Hockey Association didn't think it was good that teams would take the train to Toronto and only play one game. That was a waste of money as far as they were concerned. So the 228th Battalion was brought in order to make sure there were two teams in Toronto. He fought it right off the bat, like, this is stupid, I don't agree with this, and also argued that because they were employed by the Canadian military, they shouldn't be playing professional hockey. They shouldn't have two employers. Um, Interesting. The Battalion, this is World War One. The Battalion says, well, we're going overseas. The war's not, going as quickly as people might have hoped. And conscription starts eating up potential players too. A lot of junior age players, a lot of professional players are like, we're going over and we're going to fight in the Great War. The NHA, the National Hockey Association, had a meeting that Eddie Livingstone couldn't be at. He couldn't make it to the meeting. So while they are going, yeah, all right, we agree that the Battalion's out. That's fine. We're also going to suspend the Toronto Blue Shirts, owned by Eddie Livingstone, and we're going to take his players and disperse them through the rest of the league. Now, that's some balls to say, since you're not here and we don't like you, we're going to take your team, suspend it for the rest of the year. Oh, and we're also going to take your players and put them everywhere else for the rest of the year. And it was seen as a not too subtle way of the National Hockey Association's owners of telling Livingstone, you might want to sell your team. Livingstone didn't learn. So even though the conscription crippled the National Hockey Association, and this was part of the reason that they did it too, they couldn't find enough hockey players to fill the league. So the easiest thing to do was to screw Livingstone. This was the go-to answer for everything was, we need to find a way to screw this guy. So you could be having a meeting where you're like, it's a nice day out. Yeah, it's a nice day. Oh, there's some clouds. Do you know what would get rid of those clouds? We need to screw Livingstone over. Just ridiculous. And it's funny because he then, when his players were transferred throughout the league, they revealed Livingstone wasn't paying us. And so other owners came out, were like, he wasn't paying his players. So he of course, being reasonable and rational, he accused those owners of conspiring to turn his players against him. Now, I am not trying to paint the National Hockey Association owners as being really great guys. This was one guy against other guys, and everybody in this is kind of a prick. He sued and won versus the arenas and the former National Hockey Association owners. So the NHA owners sit down and they go, all right, we need a league without him. Agreed? So first they're having these meetings, and he's like, okay, they're having meetings without me. They're trying to get rid of me. So he went to court to try to have an injunction against them creating a new league. He knew exactly what they were doing. In an interview after the new league is created, one of the owners, I believe it was Lichtenheim, said, well, you see, we didn't do anything to Livingstone, really. The NHA still exists. He still has his team. We just formed a new league, and his league is his team. They're a one-team league. Basically, I'm paraphrasing a little bit. That's basically what he said is, oh yeah, no, we formed a new league. He can have that one, and he's the only one in that league. So he tried suing them, and players were taken. So they formed the new league, and then they decided the new league that he can have his team still, but not the players. The players, because they're under NHA contracts, they're going to the NHL. They'll just put them on NHL contracts and move them to a new team that's going to be the Torontos. They were the Torontos the first year. They were not the Toronto Arenas until after they'd won the Stanley Cup. That was a retroactively named thing. So Livingstone, understandably, think about this. You belong to a club. People tell you, we had a club membership meeting without you. How? Because we're forming a new club. All right. And we took your house. What? So he can't get an arena. He doesn't have players. And he sued the league. And he sued the former NHL or NHA owners. And you know what? He succeeded. Toronto borrowed his players. So in the end, they're like, all right, we're not taking your players. We're just borrowing them until you get your league up and running. And they agreed to pay him $9,000, which back, over 100 years ago, $9,000 is a lot of money. And they're like, we'll give you $9,000 at the end of the year. He's like, okay, fine. I'll take $9,000, but I still want in the league. So he's still suing the NHA, now the NHL, with the idea that I'm in this. I own a team. I belong here. At the end of the year, they offered him $5,958.54. That's oddly specific of here's exactly what we're going to give you instead of that $9,000. And then they bumped it up to $7,000. At that point, he's like, I am pissed. He sued them for $20,400.50. And I love that it's that specific. And he won that in 1926. Now remember, the league is formed in 1917-18, meaning he waits 8 years for that $20,000. So, yeah, the NHL was big on screwing him over. In 1918, he tries to start the Canadian Hockey Association. Doesn't work. He tried again in 1920. And one of the cities he said he was going to go to was Hamilton. So what did the NHL do? They moved the Quebec Bulldogs to Hamilton, where they became the Tigers, just to screw him. So, yeah, it wasn't that Quebec wasn't doing well enough to give it another shot. It was, well, he wants to go to Hamilton? Screw him. We'll put Quebec in Hamilton. There you go. Now where are you going to go, pal? This is pretty dicey, and it's funny because we don't have an NHL if it's not for Eddie Livingstone. I've looked it over, and I've found articles that say the same thing and books that historically have said the same thing. Without this man, we don't have the NHL. We have the NHA. February of 1926, he announced, I'm going to create the International Professional Hockey League. I'm going to put teams in Toronto, Buffalo, Detroit, New York, and Chicago. The NHL's like, nah, you're not. And they did everything they could behind the scenes and publicly to make sure that his league never got off the ground. Remember, NHL expansion to the States had become a thing, and he wanted to get in on that, and they're like, you're not, though. In 1926, when this didn't work, he instead bought the Chicago Cardinals of the American Hockey Association. And he tried to sell it in 1927. Yeah. A year later, he's like, I got buyer's remorse. I want out. Interestingly enough, the league rejected the owner that he was selling to. But Eddie Livingstone, being a frugal rich guy, didn't pay the rent. So the arena at the end of the year is like, yeah, he never paid the rent. And what did he say? He said, well, I didn't have to pay the rent. The guy who was buying the team from me agreed to pay the rent. Sorry, Mr. Livingstone. I would assume that when that falls through, that they're not going to pay the rent. I can't imagine, I'm going to buy your house. And then, oh, well, they rejected my mortgage application. And then 6 months later, they turned off my power. Why aren't you paying my hydro? Yeah. And here's the thing. The NHL never stopped hating him. The NHL never stopped deciding that this man was the evil of all evils. So what they did was they named Frank Calder president in all shapes and forms. He ruled the world. Frank Calder ruled everything. And in part, it was to fight Eddie Livingstone off. Make sure he didn't get off the ground. Frank Calder goes to the American Hockey Association. And they sit down and talk to him. And they're like, hey, so the NHL is becoming this big thing. And maybe we can help you guys out. Maybe we can have player transfers that go on. Maybe we can help develop some players. And we can have some kind of an agreement. Calder goes, yep, that's a great idea. First, kick that Eddie Livingstone out. That owner that you guys have, kick him out. If you're going to have any kind of an agreement with us, you have to kick him out. And they did. So here we are. It's 1926. It's 8 years after they screwed him out of his franchise. And they screwed him out of one in a league that they didn't even control. Have you heard of the American Hockey Association? No? Exactly. And that's kind of where he gave up. That's kind of where Eddie Livingstone became a coach in the Ontario Hockey Association. And he coached future Hall of Famers. Now, there were issues. There were players that he picked that were supposed to play on his team that wouldn't. And he had issues with them. He fought with players a lot. He had some issues with players as well. So that players would demand to go to another team, and he'd kind of try to hold them ransom before they were allowed to go. And that didn't help either. So, I mean, you can be a prick to owners. You can be a prick to players. If you're a prick to both, if you don't get along with either, you're probably not going to last. One last thing. When the NHA became the NHL, the rules, 0 changes. Their whole constitution, everything, 0 changes. Players, 0 changes. The only change was that the Toronto arenas, as I said, named after they were the Torontos the first year, They were brought in to replace the Blue Shirts / Shamrocks because they didn't want Eddie Livingstone in the league. So the next time you hear somebody say, well, the Toronto Arenas won as an expansion team, you can say, au contraire. They weren't an expansion team. They were the Screw Livingstone team. So there you go. The tragic tale of Eddie Livingstone. And it's one of the most entertaining things I think I've ever read. And it's a sign that the next time that somebody wants to say, I think the NHL has a conspiracy against, this is the most obvious and public that I've ever seen. This was the NHL ownership going, you're out. The only one that I can think of that comes close to this is Jim Balsley when he was trying to bring a team to Hamilton at all costs. That's the only one I can think of where I can actually say, you know what, the NHL really didn't want that guy as an owner. And maybe he was related to Eddie Livingstone. But there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And this has been the tragic tale of Eddie Livingstone.